Welcome to Anthodish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. When it comes to food futures, the ability to create a different outcome requires an imagination of possibilities that we may not already be considering now. Part of that involves what's called a just transition, one that's inclusive of culture and climate change and so much more. It's one thing to understand how consumers feel about it, but how do farmers approach this transition to the food system? And how do they feel about consumers' roles and responsibilities? My guest today, Dr. Bryan Dale, is here to explore these nuances. Bryan is an assistant professor in the Department of Environment, Agriculture, and Geography at Bishop's University. His research interests include food sovereignty, agroecology, climate change, environmental justice, social movements, and alternative economic initiatives, especially in food and farming. He completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the Culinaria Research Centre at the University of Toronto Scarborough and earned a PhD and MA in Human Geography with a specialization in environmental studies at the University of Toronto's Department of Geography and Planning. He has a new research paper out in Canadian Food Studies on consumers' roles in a just food system transition, going beyond individualistic or household behaviors to explore the broader frameworks required in order to achieve these goals in post-capitalistic food systems. These observations are based on his research and interviews with farmers and alternative food organizations in Ontario and Quebec. Today we explore the ideas throughout his research paper, the tensions between farmers and consumers, and the role of state interventions in these food system potentials. Here's my conversation with Bryan. All right, welcome to the show, Bryan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. It's really exciting to get to chat with you. I know your name through the food studies world, but for those who may not be familiar, do you mind giving a bit of background about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and a snapshot of the type of work you do?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Bryan Dale, and I'm an associate professor at Bishop's University, which is on Abenaki territory, and specifically in what is now known as Sherbrooke, Quebec. So for those unfamiliar with the area, it's about an hour and a half east of Montreal in the beautiful Eastern Townships. And I've lived here for about 4 years. Originally, I'm from Ontario, but was quite happy to move here because we've got it's a great university, and also we have this environment, agriculture, and geography program that has a sustainable agriculture and food systems program. So it's a very kind of cool situation to be in. We have a 140-acre farm, and I teach courses on environmental policy and food systems and all kinds of things. But I'm a human geographer by training based on my grad studies work that I did.
Awesome. Yeah, when I think Sherbrooke, Quebec too, I just think like so much farmland and how lush and green that is anytime I drive through. So I feel like it gives it a much more visual, hands-on experience for your students there as well.
We are surrounded by, and it's a smaller city, right? But we're surrounded by farmland, and it's also quite accessible to us. We just go, right outside the city, and there's lots of farmland, including a lot of ecological farms in the townships.
Awesome. That's wonderful. So that's something that we're looking a lot into today in our conversation. And you've got this great new paper out that I'll link in the show notes. But I wanted to start off by exploring the major idea within it, which is looking at this just transition in the food system. So what exactly is a just transition? What can that look like, or could that look like?
So for people that aren't familiar with the concept, it's been talked about especially in the last few decades in relation to climate change and how there could be a just transition or a fair transition for workers that are caught up in kind of fossil fuel extractive industries, and what things would look like for them to transition to other jobs, because through no fault of their own, they're actually involved in all this work that is polluting and contributing to us to continue to burn fossil fuels. So that many people have applied to the food system to think about how farmers in many cases have found themselves in a similar situation where they're doing farming that's very input intensive and contributing to climate change. And what would things look like for farmers in terms of a fair transition to a more ecological food system? But then, as I talk about in this particular paper that I published recently, like how does that look for consumers and others as well, right? What does that look like for society, basically, for us to kind of shift towards a more climate friendly or ecological food system? And the thing to remember, I think, is I often remind people that we overlook sometimes just how important it is to think about this in terms of the urgency of climate change and the fact that we need to change our food system. There's all kinds of reasons that we need to change our food system, but there's approximately 30% of greenhouse gas emissions that are linked with the food system globally. And a lot of that is how we actually produce food and do the production on farms. So yeah, there's a lot to be said there about the justice aspects of how we actually think about that transition. And people in in the academic world often kind of break things down in a way similar to how we talk about environmental justice, like the distributive justice, the procedural justice, recognition-based justice, about how that kind of works in thinking about a transition like this.
And I appreciate that you're trying to kind of pick up those fragments in the paper and in your work, because I think that's something that, as you said, it gets dropped a lot, or it's so complex to look at that it makes sense to try and like niche down into something. But through your work, you're also really unpacking this idea of the consumer in a much more nuanced way. I think that's, especially in more public domains, we've got a lot of like consumer led boycotts lately. And the idea of the consumer is, it can feel a little flat sometimes. So I'm curious about your perspectives on like why consumers get simplified and how this limits our imaginations around what food futures can look like too.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's especially easy for academics like me to be kind of like doing this in a way that's like, oh yeah, just like consumers and dealing with things in a way that's kind of two-dimensional. So first of all, I guess to be clear, like I talked to a lot of farmers primarily as I did my research that led to this particular paper. And through a lot of my research in the last several years, like I've really focused on talking to farmers. But one thing that they kept kind of leaning towards is producer-consumer relations, right? Their relationship with the consumer and how in many cases they're constrained through like consumption patterns or like the behavior of consumers. So, I talked to others as I did a lot of this research. I talked to people involved with like alternative food initiatives and so on. But just to be clear, my perspective is kind of like informed by farmers' experiences dealing with consumers. So there's other people who have done studies and looked at like consumer behavior more directly and done questionnaires and that kind of thing. But I think one thing in terms of complexifying that view on consumers that we need to keep in mind is that consumers are not two-dimensional and they do have power in terms of those decisions that they make. We saw in the pandemic, for example, how many people suddenly were like trying to think about alternative food initiatives, CSA programs or community supported agriculture, looking at farmers markets, right, as these outdoor spaces, which were shut down for a while, but supporting those different ways, because suddenly it was like, hey, wait a minute, our immediate access to the grocery store, which is how most people in the Canadian context and in many other places are getting food, was suddenly not. Maybe it was still accessible. It was deemed an essential service, but it was suddenly not as safe a place. And so people were wondering about the security of supply chains in those early days in 2020 when the pandemic broke out. So that kind of shift over a year to 2 years, like really demonstrated that people can shift their consumer behavior, right? And that I think is important to keep in mind, that consumers respond to events like this. We're seeing it now with what's happening with the United States and a trade war, where people are suddenly saying we're going to consume differently. So things change, and it's not always easy for everybody to make those decisions, right? Like I'm a consumer, but I'm also kind of looking at this from a bird's eye view as well. And but I acknowledge as I do that I'm super privileged. I'm a white middle class guy who's got all kinds of benefits, societal privileges that I've had throughout my life. And some people as consumers are also not enjoying those privileges, right? A single racialized mom, for example, working multiple jobs doesn't necessarily have the same flexibility if they're constrained in terms of finances to be going out and buying food that might be more expensive, or to be buying food that is going to be cooked from scratch instead of relying on shortcuts like some processed foods and so on. So yeah, I think that those kind of complexities have to be kept in mind as we think about this.
Certainly, yeah. I think those are really good points, and it also strikes me too as, a lot of it is bound within the confines of capitalism in terms of like how we're thinking about food and consuming food and purchasing food as a limiting factor, which your paper speaks to as well.
Yeah. This is part of the reason that sometimes academics do that kind of like two-dimensional thing, is we're just like, look at it from like a political economics standpoint. We're just like, it's just commodity fetishism. So if people want to make changes, they're just going to go try to shop responsibly, which we should problematize, right? Like there's more to it if we're going to think about a just transition or real systemic transformation to bring about a more ecological and fair food system. But yeah, that's part of the reason we sometimes go that route.
Yeah, totally. And what was really surprising to me too is, you're identifying some of the motivations that consumers have. And I'd like to think that, I'm also in Guelph, which I know is like hippie central. So maybe that has clouded my judgment a bit. But I'd like to think that more people are making choices, not just for themselves, but for the planet. But can you speak a bit to some of the motivations that you, were researching about what consumers are thinking about when they're thinking about sustainable food.
Well, I definitely have heard from multiple farmers that their consumers are often much more focused on health as opposed to environment, right? So
Yeah.
they want to support the kind of pesticide free production and everything else, but often it's like, well, I want to eat healthy. I'm concerned about pesticide residues or whatever else it might be that my kids are going to consume. I'm concerned about sometimes the uncertainty of genetically modified foods and what's entailed with that. And so often like kind of the environment gets pushed to the side, and climate change specifically. But for people that do take it up, from what farmers tell me, they appreciate that people are motivated in many cases to eat in a way that's going to think about, well, what are the greenhouse gas emissions connected with these food choices, this or that food choice. And I guess the only time when it becomes a bit problematic is when we look at something as in a very simplistic way, like I'm really just going to focus on transportation, which is not what we should necessarily be focusing on. It's much more about production, for example. Or I know that meat production is problematic, industrial meat production especially. And so I'm going to be, just going vegan and then assuming that that's kind of my role that I'm going to play. And that's kind of that. And especially farmers that do ecological livestock production, they get frustrated by those kinds of the simple kinds of approaches in terms of people's motivations, because then farmers can feel vilified for raising animals, when in many cases, historically and in many parts of the world, it's really important to have animal production as part of an agroecological system where you're combining raising animals and also doing other things, crops and so on. And we've kind of just gotten used to this artificial separation in North America, especially, where we've got just one type of production and just another type of production, but that separation of animals and other kinds of production is very artificial and in many cases problematic, and not kind of treating agriculture like an ecosystem. So yeah, those are all kinds of things that farmers talk to me about. It's not to say that consumers aren't aware, or they're not thinking about these things carefully, but it's just that often we don't have enough information as consumers to really make good decisions, or think about, well, how can I help beyond just making this decision about not eating meat or shopping locally or whatever it might be. And sometimes that's a big part of it, right? How we change that access to information that people need to have a better understanding of what's going on in the food system.
Yeah. And it reminds me of a piece that you were looking at in the paper too, where, across it, you kind of feel like these tensions between the public and farmers, and the plight of the farmers, like a lot of times their voices don't necessarily get heard in these conversations. So I was thinking too about, particularly with the CSA farms that you're talking about, where that piece of, CSA membership contributes to income stability and financial stability for farmers. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the tensions that emerge when people maybe make certain choices for a certain amount of time and then drop the trend, I guess?
Yeah. So I'm assuming many people that are listening would be like familiar with CSA programs, but the basic idea, if people aren't, is that community supported agriculture is where you pay upfront, just like I do with the CSA program I'm part of, where you pay upfront for the food boxes that you're going to get on a weekly or biweekly basis, typically, and that could be delivered maybe, but often at a drop point where you're going to go someplace to pick up your box of veggies. There's also meat CSAs, and the model has changed over time, right? Like it's really great that we've got CSA programs that provide that kind of income stability. So you pay at the beginning of the season, the farmer knows their production costs are going to be covered. You as a consumer wouldn't necessarily have a choice if suddenly something happens and broccoli isn't available because there's been a pest infestation or drought or whatever, but there will be some other food, right? So some of the farmers I've talked to were discussing this, is that the CSA models are trying to get more and more convenient for consumers. That's kind of just how essentially we're used to this kind of neoliberal mentality that is about just assuming that the models or the kind of the approaches around producer-consumer relations has to be a competitive one, where like, you're competing with the grocery store, but now you're competing with home delivery meal kits and all those kinds of things. And one farmer in particular who I quoted in the title of the paper was basically saying, like, we've got this situation where we are kind of having to bend over backwards to keep consumers engaged. Some other farmers were saying it's through like social media. They're just working so hard, right? Because the consumers are basically like, well, I don't feel necessarily a lot of solidarity with the farmer that I'm engaged with. I'm just a consumer, and they have to kind of cater to me as a client. It's not that this is like all people, but this is one thing with CSAs where there's kind sometimes these tensions where it's not about kind of a relationship that's based on solidarity and trust and kind of like, understanding of what's happening on the farm, and the need for those kinds of support systems to be in place, where people have to sometimes feel really responsible that, like, if they have to go on vacation, for example, they should find someone to pick up their box for them, right? As opposed to like,
Yeah.
I just want to have like these different options for farmers to cater to my needs as opposed to the other way around. So
Yeah.
yeah. And this is true for other alternative food initiatives, and farmers markets and so on are similar in many cases.
Yeah, it's interesting, like when you're speaking to the idea of like what that relationship entails, because it really does feel like it's this expectation that these relationships have to be very specific to almost like a parasocialist or parasocialism that you get with like content creators or influencers, where people develop these connections that they feel that they have with someone that they're not actually engaging with. So I find that kind of an interesting piece too of adding that, like when you're talking about farmers having to use Instagram and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? I mean, because it's not always easy for everybody to develop that relationship. Like I said, I mean,
Yeah.
it might be fine for me to go pick up a CSA box, but the flip side is that it's also, going to add to somebody's workload to do that domestic labor or social reproduction work, as we call it, to be figuring out how you can procure some food that's going to be maybe ecologically friendly and more healthy, but it's also, going to take you out of your way and be more complicated than going to the grocery store to do everything as like one-stop shopping. So I've got these like tensions in my head because I'm simultaneously like, well, how can like alternative food initiatives actually be much more kind of like logistically feasible for consumers? And at the same time, how do we kind of get out of this mindset that everything just has to be about the convenience of the consumer too?
Yeah. I'd imagine, I don't know if you're a sticky note kind of person, like when you're mapping out stuff, but I'd imagine there's a lot of sticky notes in like trying to sort out how all of those pieces fit together.
Yeah, as I was working on this paper, there's definitely lots of brainstorming that went into on paper what I ended up doing, and including this figure about kind of what I was hearing from farmers about kind of the political economic implications of what they were suggesting, right? Like how much state intervention we use and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that's another piece too, when we're talking about food, particularly in Canada right now, we're talking a lot about like food affordability, the cost of living crisis, all these pieces connecting. And when we're looking at declines in interest in CSA farming and things like that, I think that tends to be the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, food is getting more expensive. And you've got a great part of the paper where you're exploring that more. One line from a farmer in particular that really struck me was when they were saying, I don't want to talk about making food affordable. I want to talk about making people be able to afford food. So what are your thoughts on food affordability? And, is it that the food costs fluctuate more visibly than other, bills or day-to-day household costs?
Yeah, I mean, these two things are happening at the same time, right? We've got food prices that are fluctuating, including recently we've seen this with inflation and everything else, but it's also like a set cost. You're probably going to want to be feeding you and your family.
Yeah.
If you want to eat every day, like you're going to be weighing this. And of course, you've got other fixed costs that are competing with this, like housing and medication for some people and other things that you want to be worrying about. That is a tricky thing. And I heard from different farmers on this, including the one that, you referenced, I quoted. And some people are saying like, we have to look at the bigger picture where people are struggling with housing costs, for example, that have skyrocketed. You said the word capitalism earlier. This is all part of kind of like broader trends within the capitalist system where a lot of prices are increasing. And as another farmer said, we've got to, people have to pay for their cell phone bills and like this and that, right? But we assume in many cases that food has to be cheap, right? And that the best food is cheap food. And that's like a cultural thing that is difficult for us to wrap our heads around, just how we've kind of grown to assume that that is like the best, or that we should always focus on like the low prices of food as being the most important thing to focus on. Not that everybody does that, but it's tricky. And in terms of like thinking about how we can make it so that more people can afford food as opposed to just making food more affordable, well, basically that's important because we need to make sure that the costs of doing more ecological food production can be covered. And it is in many cases more expensive to do, because of labor costs and so on, to do ecological food production than relying on pesticides and fertilizers and other things that make conventional farming possible. So I have a whole separate research project on basic income and how that could look for the food system. But part of the reason I'm interested in that is because I keep hearing from farmers that like basic income is an idea that would help farmers, help consumers, quite quite possibly help people across the food system. And I think that that's one kind of key idea where if you had a basic income guarantee, you would have it so that you lifted people out of poverty in a way that social assistance programs and so on just aren't able to do these days. And we could talk all about basic income, but there's like lots of great information online. Coalition Canada is one group that I've been connected with who does this work. I'll provide you with their website later. You can put it in the show notes. I think it's coalitioncanada.ca. But in any case, some colleagues and myself have written a bit about this because it's interesting to see how could basic income support food security generally in the Canadian context, and make kind of ecologically grown food more accessible to people. But also it could do a lot for supporting the food producers themselves. And it's kind of interesting to see what would be needed for that to actually work in a way that complements and doesn't just replace existing supports that exist for farmers, for example.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it strikes me too, I'm thinking about some of the shifts that we've had in Canadian immigration policy in the last couple of years and how that's affected migrant laborers who we so very much depend on for food production. So thinking about how universal basic income can also kind of make the system so that it's not forcing migrant labor to work for, virtually nothing as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and that's one of the tricky questions, right? Like, are migrant workers, for example, going to be eligible for a basic income? I think that would be absolutely essential, right? To think about making sure that they have access to the same kinds of social supports as other people in this country, because currently they're not. And we've got something like 12% of the agricultural workforce, which is done by migrant workers. It's generally racialized workforce, relying on people from Central America and the Caribbean to do a lot of the growing of food and work in many cases, not all, but in many cases work in pretty terrible conditions, desperate kinds of housing conditions and so on to grow that food for us. So yeah, this would be, and a lot of them are also doing ecological or local food production.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure that those farmers, but also a lot of the migrant workers that are doing this work, how are they supported better through a just transition?
Definitely. So that kind of lends itself to the question of, what can be done at a state level? Because that's something that you explore a bit, that farmers have certain ideas around how the state could work within this just transition. How would that work? And are there ways to encourage consumers to make more seasonal or local choices that are in support of these initiatives as well?
Yeah, so it's easy sometimes for me as an academic or other academics to sit back and say, well, this can happen and that can happen, and the state should do this and that as a policy framework. But ultimately, I was hearing from farmers that they have all these ideas that are essentially kind of ways that the state could get involved differently than what we've seen recently, right? So in Quebec, for example, like during the pandemic, there was this kind of encouragement of local consumption. We've seen that generally, right? Quebec likes to be very sovereign in many ways, right? And think about autosuffisance alimentaire or self-sufficiency in our food. But it's often very kind of economistic. And this happens in other places too. In Ontario, you've got Foodland Ontario labels. Here we've got Aliments du Québec. In other provinces, it's similar, right? It's yay, local consumption, and governments help with some of that kind of marketing and so on. But it can go way beyond that. And so farmers talk to me about how, similar to a basic income, what if farmers were paid a salary to do the work that they're doing, which is incredibly important. That's a pretty radical idea but it isn't impossible to imagine happening. One farmer said, what if we had basically a food stamp type program where food was decommodified and everybody, regardless of their income level and wealth, was able to have the same access to food, right? That sounds also radical, not impossible to imagine happening, but people would automatically think, oh, that's kind of like a socialist system instead of a free market capitalism, right? What if there was education, right? Is another big piece of it, which we've already started talking about a bit, right? The education could look so different if we had what people call critical food literacy, right? Thinking not just about cooking and so on, but actually how the food system works. If that was taught starting from a young age in one way, shape, or form, that would have an impact, so that by the time we're in our 20s and are young adults and older, thinking about how you navigate these difficult choices about supporting a more climate-friendly food system, you would have the answers at your fingertips more readily.
Yeah.
So and farmers had great ideas about how that could work through better kind of state support, and even ideas like having agricultural service or food service, where just like in some countries you've got military service and it's assumed that people are going to be at
Oh,
some
yeah.
point in their life enlisted for a short period of time to do that. Well, what if everybody was working for 6 months on a farm and 6 months in food service in some way, shape, or form, and got that hands-on experience to give them a better sense of what's going on in the food system? I mean, again, not an impossible.
And a better variation of enlisting in something, I would say.
Yes, better than military service.
Yep. Yeah, it reminds me. I was speaking last season with Joshna Maharaj around these sorts of topics too, and she made that distinction of, we don't have like a minister of food, we don't have food policy that's robust and rigorous and similar to what you're saying. It's like that fracturing where we're looking at agriculture, we're looking at energy sectors, but we're not looking at it as this collective version of food where we can have that food literacy or that food knowledge. So I think that that really speaks to, we're operating and you're trying to sort through a system of all these fragmented parts and envisioning what could happen to make that just transition so that it's more equitable and less fractured as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Josh knows great, and other people have talked about this need that to not operate in silos, right? But it's so important for us to get over that, and that's the difficulty when food kind of is addressed by sort of so many different governmental departments, but also different orders of government in Canada, at least in the complex kind of constitutional situation that we have where there's shared powers between provinces and the federal government, and then there's also municipalities that have a big role to play. It would be great if we had different, I think, food policy councils at different levels that had people kind of engaged in their food system at the municipal level, maybe at the provincial level, at the federal level. Like we started to see that in different ways, but I won't get into the complexities of the federal National Food Policy Council. But I think things actually, especially if people feel like they have a way to get involved and the procedural justice element is worked out about how people envision this transition in the food system. If we kind of have that kind of decision making done in a way that counters a lot of the powerful interests from corporations and big industry associations, kind of having their voices overrepresented in those discussions, then like you could have a pretty powerful model for looking at that policy change. And state involvement then doesn't just have to be like top down, right? It doesn't just have to be about the federal or other levels of government dictating what happens for people.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I think it really invokes the idea of like a collective imagination of something different and that like the power of that imagination, because I feel like we're in a place right now where we don't necessarily always think that we can imagine or envision something separate from the system that we're in. So I really appreciate your work for kind of pushing the boundaries of what people can think and envision for that food future as well.
Yeah, the capitalist system that we'd referenced already is part of that culture that we're just embedded with, right? Like in thinking that there is no alternative, which Margaret Thatcher said back in the 80s, right? As at the dawn of the neoliberal era. And that's taken hold, right? It's basically been through my lifetime that it's like, it's just capitalism. And the
Yeah.
only other options that exist have been tried and they have failed, and we know that no other system essentially is going to work as well as capitalism, even if capitalism is problematic in some ways. And that kind of lack of imagination about the alternatives is something that we can absolutely challenge. And in this paper and in some others, I try to write about how, in many cases, farmers and consumers involved in different kinds of alternative food initiatives and so on actually have a vision for us doing things differently. And as many feminist political economists, for example, argue, there's not just that capitalism is this monolith that can't be changed, right? It's something that's much more complex, and we can see that there are alternatives that exist within this framework, despite the constraints, right? That we can see that there's other kinds of alternative economic arrangements, even things like community supported agriculture programs that include like some kind of solidarity option, so that there's like solidarity or social pricing. And this isn't just for CSAs, it can happen for grocery stores and so on. There's, in many cases, a way to acknowledge that some people are less able to afford some of these things. So let's look at a way to support the people to get access to this great food without making them pay as much as other people. And those options, those alternatives work really well. They're just done at a smaller scale. And they're marginalized, but in many ways, they're actually anti-capitalist, right? Even CSA
Yeah.
programs in the traditional models are pretty anti-capitalist, right? They're not just focusing on profit for profit's sake.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, Brian, thank you so very much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed your paper. I thought it was such a great push in a direction that we very, very much need. Do you mind sharing where people can find you online if they want to learn more about the research that you're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have a website. It's bryandale.ca, Brian with a Y. dale.ca. And it's probably the best place to connect with me. I've got like links to my academia webpage and Instagram and so on there. Not that I'm super active on social media. That is one thing I do not do, is promote myself very much on social media, including work like papers that come out. But yeah, people can get in touch with me and read more about other publications I've put out and so on.
Thank you very much, Bryan. I appreciate you coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
That was Dr. Bryan Dale. I've linked his research article and websites in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthrodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthrodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please rate us on Apple to help get the word out. For more Anthrodish, sign up to my newsletter at sarahdougnan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky at Anthrodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you've been thinking about food. Music composition was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthrodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.